Yes, indeedy, folks. It's the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo! And now, let's pay our respects to Herod the Great, a man that National Geographic has called Architect of the Holy Land. Herod was appointed king of Judea in 37 BCE, which would be about 2,050 years ago. He reigned for 34 years. Herod the Great should not be confused with his youngest son, Antipas. When Herod the Great died, the kingdom was given to Antipas's elder brother, who became king of Judea. Antipas became a ruler of a quarter of the empire, what they called a tetrarch. And here, once again, your beer drinking guide will apologize to anyone out there trying to cover their ears because of the way I pronounced Antipas or tetrarch. Mispronounced or not, it was Herod Antipas, who was not the king of Judea. He was one of the rulers of one of the parts of Judea. It was Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great, who oversaw the execution of Jesus of Nazareth and the beheading of John the Baptist. By the time of John the Baptist and Jesus, Herod had been dead for several years. He died in 4 before the current era. In the story of Matthew, it was Herod the Great who saw the 3 wise men when they came looking for the new king of the Jews. This was rather startling news to Herod, since he was king of the Jews, and so he asked them to go find this new king and to report back to him. Of course, we know the rest of that story. They did not report back, and so Herod went and slaughtered all of the children of Bethlehem, all the male children, in order to just make sure that his throne was not jeopardized. The story about the massacre of the innocents that was told in the book of Matthew has long been a revered tradition in the Western Christian world. I find it amusing that the depictions of the massacre of the innocents that we find in Europe during the time of the Crusades look surprisingly like the images that we find of what the Crusaders were doing in the Middle East at the same time. After centuries of study by the world's best biblical and historic scholars, we have come to understand that King Herod could be a tyrant. However, for all his tyranny, we have come to understand that the one thing that King Herod certainly did not do is the one thing that he is most famous for in the Christian world, and that was the massacre of the innocents. There are many different reasons that scholars have come to believe that the massacre of the innocents never happened. Any good scholar or scientist understands that you do not rely on information from just one source. Now, it's probably okay to believe Aunt Alma when she tells you that her husband was a tyrant who made her bake an apple pie for him once a week. But when you're looking at large historic events, or when you're proving scientific theorem, the fact is you don't take one person's word for it. And yet, despite centuries of work studying and looking for collaborating evidence, we have never found any evidence of King Herod's massacre of the innocents except in Matthew's depiction of the story. The book of Matthew was written some 80 years after Christ. While it is attributed to Matthew, the disciple of Christ, the fact is it was not written by Matthew. The fact is it was written by a person in the early church, as the church was beginning to form, who had an agenda. And that agenda was to bring the Jewish people into the Christian church. And the way they were doing that was by telling stories that proved that Christ was the fulfillment of the prophecies that had been written about in the Torah. Of course, the Torah is what became the Old Testament in the Christian church. It was very common during the early Christian church, and indeed it had been common in religious history for hundreds of years before this, to tell stories in a way that they fulfilled the prophecies of those who had come before. By writing your religious texts this way, it gives your new religion legitimacy with the prevailing congregations. Not only would people write their stories to show that their story fulfills prophecy, they would also go back and tweak the prophecies. This was very common, and we shall see it worked in the telling of the massacre of the innocents as well. Scholars have become real good at picking these things out. In the case of the story of the massacre of the innocents, the prophecy that was being fulfilled came from Jeremiah, a prophet from the 7th century before current era, and whose story is told in the book of Lamentations. Jeremiah had written, "A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children." The author of the book of Matthew used this statement from Jeremiah to say that there had been a prophecy that there would be great wailing and moaning when the Messiah came, and that this wailing and moaning came about because of Herod's massacre of the innocents. Like many of the books that were written and tried to prove ancient prophecies coming true by the early Christian authors, this was apparently written by somebody who did not know much about the Jewish tradition. The fact is, Jeremiah had been talking about the Babylonian exile, when indeed Rachel did weep for her children. The bogus fulfillment of prophecies that were trying to be achieved in Matthew are only one reason why scholars have come to think that the massacre of the innocents never happened. Another reason they discount the story is because of the historian Flavius Josephus. Josephus was a historian that lived from about 37 to 100 current era. He was Jewish, and he wrote very prolifically about the history that had been told him of all this era. Even though the Jewish people were in revolt against the empire, and even though Josephus did write accurately, but with a sympathetic ear to the Jewish cause, he was so well regarded by the Romans that, from what we can tell from the records, there was a bust of him, a marble bust, erected in Rome. Josephus covered many historic details about the Jewish people at this time, and yet nowhere in any of his writings have we found any reference to the slaughter of a whole town's worth of male children. It is certain that any event as substantial and as shocking as murdering every male child from birth through the age of 6 would have gotten to the ears of Josephus. And it is difficult to believe that an historian as accurate as thorough, and as prolific as Josephus would not have written down such a major event. Not only did Josephus not write this story down, there were absolutely no mentions in any contemporary references. You would think that if everyone came and slaughtered all the male children in your town, somebody would make a note of it. Not everyone wrote at that time, of course, but many people did. Some nobleman, some merchant, somebody would have made a note of it. The fact is, we have lots of records from Bethlehem at this time, and before this time, and after this time. None of them mention having every male child from the age of birth through 6 be murdered. And not only is there no record of this event from any of Bethlehem's records or any of the records from towns nearby, there is absolutely no mention of this event in any of the historic records from any of the surrounding countries. Not in Rome, not in Egypt, not in Persia. Nowhere was something as atrocious as this mentioned in any histories. At the time, just as today, it was very common that if something like this had happened, then you would be telling stories about it all over your country to prove what barbarians all of those people on the other side of the border are. And yet, nowhere in the ancient world, in the thousands of texts that have come down to us, has there ever been any mention of the slaughter of innocents in the town of Bethlehem. And not only was there no mention of it in any historic records, there was no other mention of it anywhere in the Bible. Luke and John never mentioned it. It's not mentioned in the Old Testaments. It isn't mentioned anywhere except in 3 verses of Matthew. The story is simply not independently verified anywhere. Of course, not all Bibles are the same. The Protestants and many different Protestant sects, the Catholics, the Mormons, the Eastern Orthodox, and many other subsets of Christianity all have their own versions of the Bible and what has been canonized as officially true and what has been left out as either not true or heresy. The parts of the Bible that are included in some Bibles and not others are called the Apocrypha. Those religions have said, well, perhaps these are not part of the official canonized Bible that came from the Council of Nicaea. However, we believe that these Apocrypha do belong in the Bible. There are many different Apocrypha, and they are included or not included in several different versions of different Bibles. Of all the different Apocrypha, and there are lots of them, only one mentions Herod's massacre of the innocents, and that is the Proto-Evangelium of James. The Proto-Evangelium of James was written around 150 current era, between 40 and 60 years after the author of Matthew had published the book of Matthew. This book claimed to be the testament of James, the elder half-brother of Jesus. However, it was written 150 years after he would have been dead. It was probably pretty certainly written by someone else who, again, had an agenda. This author would have been familiar with the story of the massacre of the innocents that had been written in Matthew some 40 to 60 years earlier. He included it in his account of the Protoevangelium of James. One of the interesting things about the Protoevangelium of James is that it was the first to come out with the veneration of Mary. This was 150 years after the death of Christ. He came to regard Mary as a perpetual virgin, not only before the birth of Christ and through the birth of Christ, but through her entire life. This became a very popular part of the religion in the Orthodox Church. In much of the world today, the perpetual virginity of Mary is a very important and basic structure in the Christian church. We all know that married women do not stay virgins. And so part of the story in the Protoevangelium of James is that Joseph was not her husband. He was appointed to her as a guardian. The virtue of Mary became such a compulsion in parts of the church that even her birth had to be made into something not bound by the rules of life. And that is where we came up with the concept of Immaculate Conception. Immaculate Conception was not the conception of Christ. It was the conception of Mary. Mary's Immaculate Conception, however, came after the Protoevangelium of James. The Protoevangelium of James was happy simply to make sure that she was a perpetual virgin, that she was not married to Joseph, and, indeed, that she was the new Eve, the new mother of the race. And that, my friends, is why scholars have come to believe that Herod's massacre of the innocents never happened. The bottom line is, it doesn't make sense, and there is absolutely no account of it except in 3 verses of one part of one book. What we do know Herod did was he built almost all of the sites that pilgrims go to see when they go to the Holy Land were built by Herod the Great. And we will look into Herod the Great, builder, tyrant, and buried. Next time, we pay homage to Herod the Great, here on the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo. Now available from your beer drinking guide to the Great Wahoo, you can get DVD movies made up from different stories that have been shown here on the Great Wahoo. So far, there are 4 different DVDs with 7 different movies. You can check out the world's 2 greatest river floods, both of which happened right here in Idaho. If that seems like a tall order to fulfill, there is a short 11-minute movie that looks into the claims that these are the biggest floods that have ever happened in the geologic history of the Earth. Another DVD looks at driving around the Albions and through the City of Rocks, as well as having a movie on the Boise Kelton stage. This stage was pulled by galloping horses night and day for 40 hours. It was quick, but can you imagine being behind galloping horses with all of the dust and being thrown around on a rough ride for 40 hours? Egad! Of Pooh You and the Great Wahoo is a 1.5-hour movie that gives an extensive look at how we turn sewage into river water. In 24 hours, what you flushed becomes swimmable and fishable. And there is a DVD with 2 40-minute movies about Boise High, about building the old campus and heating it, and the renovation that they did in the 1990s. Also available on DVD are copies of your own favorite shows, or if there was some story that was serialized on several different Great Wahoos, I can take those different segments of the story and put them on a DVD for you. For more information on my DVD movies or having your own made from past episodes of The Great Wahoo, please feel free to contact me, your beer drinking guide to the Great Wahoo, at beerdrinker@greatwahoo.com. And here we go with another all-true train story. How can you not enjoy a big old train coming roaring at you at 50, 60, 70 miles an hour, making all that noise, the sound of the engines going by, and then the rattle and the clack of the cars? But just how do they figure out how many engines to put at the head of a train, and how powerful each of those engines has to be? Well, the first two parts of that, of course, are pretty darn simple. I'm sure you've thought about it enough to realize there are two main factors in deciding how to pull a train. The first factor is the route that it's going to be going over. The steeper the route, the more power you need to pull the train. It doesn't take the sharpest brick in the bucket to figure out that pulling a train up the yellow line in this illustration would take a lot less power than pulling a train up the blue line. So it is that pulling a train over the low, rolling spaces of the Midwest takes a different power consumption in the train than pulling them over the Rocky Mountains. In conjunction with how steep the grade is, there is also the consideration of how much does the train weigh. Of course, the weight of a train depends on how many cars are being pulled and whether those cars are empty or full. That all seems plenty straightforward enough, but there is another consideration that the railroads take into account when they're figuring out the horsepower needed to pull a train. Indeed, one of the most important considerations when figuring out the horsepower to ton ratio in pulling a train is what is called the Transportation Service Plan. The main consideration in a transportation service plan is what is the priority of the train. And the priority of the train depends on what it is pulling. In this movie, we see what they call an intermodal train. This is the highest priority train on the rail. These intermodal boxes are filled at the manufacturer, taken to ports, put on ships, brought to the United States, put on rail, and shipped across the United States. They might be electronics for Walmart, in which case they are literally the warehouse for Walmart, and Walmart somewhere across the country is depending on one of these boxes being delivered on time so they can stock their shelves. Of course, I am using the term Walmart quite figuratively here. It could be any business in the United States looking for this material to be delivered on time. These boxes could also be taken across the United States, loaded on a ship, and sent to Europe. In fact, the first transcontinental railroad in the United States was not to get goods or services or people across the country. It was to get goods from China to Europe, and taking them across the United States was so much faster than taking them around the continents. The transportation service plan for these intermodal trains says that the horsepower in the engine will be enough to keep the train at full speed over the entire grade of the route. The second priority in the transportation service plan is what they call unit trains. Unit trains carry coal, grain, fertilizer, and other mass quantities of products. These unit trains pull all the same commodity in all the same kind of cars. These trains have second priority on the track, and the horsepower for these unit trains is figured at the minimum amount that it takes to pull the train across the crest of the grade. Of course, there are also the old workhorse trains. Might have some oil on them, might have some lumber. They'll be made up of different things. And those trains, the power is calculated on the average over the past, say, several months of the weight of the trains. So, there you have it. Enough horsepower to get our stuff where we want it to be. Today, ladies and gentlemen, on Beautiful Lessons. We look at what is to be gained by learning the lessons of laundry love. Good, sweet Howard. What a fine young man he was, but rather lonely. One day, Howard got the brilliant idea that a good place to meet chicks would be the laundromat. Sure enough, he did meet some fine ladies there, and he enjoyed chatting with them about all the things that you can possibly chat about while folding your laundry. But, alas, it was only a few weeks before Howard realized that the laundromat is not the place he was going to meet the lady of his dreams. He came to realize that any woman who cannot afford a washing machine is never going to be able to support him. And that's this week's Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you next week. And in the meantime, keep celebrating the Great Wahoo.